So this is what, because I want to talk with you about Gramsci tonight, and I want to bridge this, and I'm going to start, it's not directly related, but this is why I want to know more about Gramsci, and I've read Gramsci a bit, and I'm using him for my book, actually. But this is maybe one of the most moving quotes I've ever been exposed to, and Professor Harvey K. actually forwarded this to me. Great Harvey K., another real teacher on our show. And this is Gramsci in 1937. He's writing to his son from prison when he's actually in the process of dying. Okay. I think you must like history as I liked it when I was your age, because it deals with living people and everything that concerns people. As many people as possible, all people in the world, insofar as they unite together in society and work and struggle and make a bid for a better life. And you can't fail to please you. All that can't fail to please you more than anything else. Isn't that right? That's an incredible quote to me. And I think that part of what happens, even when you're explaining these things that seem so common sense, like, why do we want to live in a boom and bust economy where resources are so scarce? I'll throw one other example, and I did a illicit history recently with Professor Jamila Michener, brilliant healthcare historian at Cornell. We talked about the history of Medicaid. And at the end of the conversation, as it broadened out, her point actually was like, basically, unless you're Jeff Bezos, this health system is a threat to you. You could be making $1 million a year, and if your child is born with a certain condition, it could wipe you out. I mean, this is fundamentally unacceptable and dangerous even to some of the most privileged people in the history of the planet. So we know that. And not only do we know that, we literally experience it every day. And then on the other side of it, and I feel that weird voice in the back of my head, even with my politics, when I hear you speak, it's like, well, I don't know, but if we do that, we do these things, and in fact, I'm working for it. Are we going to miss something? Is it going to become bad? And that's where I'm wondering if you could bridge Gramsci and hegemony, because I've almost started to think of hegemony as almost like even that kinesthetic sense of an irrational fear of an obvious change we should pursue.
Yeah, I think you're putting together in your last comment there the wisdom of Gramsci and the enormous gift his imprisonment in a dialectical marvel gave us. He was in jail. Mussolini put him in jail in the early 1920s and kept him in there until he killed him in 1937-38. The man had been the head of the Communist Party in Italy, had been a dynamic leader. I don't know if people are aware of it. He was born and raised on the island of Sardinia, an unspeakably poor island at that time. It's not, other than for tourists, it's still basically a poor place. And he was born deformed. His body was all bent. And as a young person, his parents believed that he would die because he was so misshapen as an infant. And so what they did, in the superstitious way that that part of the poor Italian population lived, is he didn't sleep in a bed for a long period of time. He slept in his own coffin. That was what they did.
Jesus Christ.
And he would try to imagine what it would mean to wake up each day in something that you knew would be where you would end up. Well, he didn't die. He grew up. He never overcame that. He was a misshapen adult, too. But he became the leader. He told a story when he was older, if this is not taking us too far away.
No, go wherever you want, please.
He told the story of being on a train after he had become the head of the Communist Party. And people should remember, he became head of the Communist Party in Italy at a time when the Communist Party was the biggest and most powerful Communist Party anywhere in Europe. It was a stunningly successful Communist Party for a long time. And that was devoted, he took a lot of credit for that and had a lot of credit for it. So he was on a train somewhere, and a person was sitting opposite him, and they got into a conversation, and after a while, the person said, well, it's very interesting to talk to you. Who are you? And he said, well, my name's Antonio Gramsci. And the guy got angry. He said, Gramsci? That's our great leader. The guy could not put together the great leader of the Communist Party and this gnarly little man. And it really kept going. And I don't think he ever convinced the guy that he wasn't a megalomaniac rather than who he was. Anyway,
Jesus.
So he's in prison for all those years, badly treated. His illnesses got much worse. He wasn't cared for. It was a way of slowly killing the guy, which in the end it did. But the thing about Gramsci, the gift he gives, which is where you're going with this, and I think you're quite right to do it, is that Gramsci was always agonized over the following thing. His first introduction into big-time politics was a massive general strike that took place in the Italian city of Turin, Torino in Italian, which was the home then, as it still is, of the Fiat automobile company. And he led, that's how he became kind of a big leader, he led a strike, a massively successful strike for a long time. In the end, it wasn't so successful, but for a long time, he led the workers out in Torino. And out of that experience and in the immediate years thereafter, he reached the following crisis, if you might say it. His observation was the workers are really badly treated. They know they're badly treated. They know who's badly treating them. It isn't a mystery. Or to use his language, the objective situation is ripe for a revolution, for the majority to rise up and stop the exploitation that is their daily life. But they're not doing it. And we can't get them to do it. Why is that? Why is it that the objective circumstance is clear, is decisive, and gives us the chance to win, but the subjective, that's how he reasoned it, the way people think is blocking them from seeing and doing what they're able to do. They could win tomorrow. We could have won that strike. We could take over this society. So he began to do what he felt Marxists had been not so good at, to look at the subjective, to look at the ways people think about the world, which may not enable them to see or to act in ways that are their own self-interest, given the objective. Now, that's a very modern question because it's agonizing American progressives to this moment.
Right.
Why is the obvious inequality that gets worse each day, the instability of a system which just crashed in 2008 after 40 years in which people in my profession taught 2 generations of students that we didn't have to worry about this anymore because we had learned all the lessons in the Great Depression that would preclude us having what we just had again. So you have objective circumstance after objective circumstance in the world, and yet people, like you said just now, hesitate, feel they might lose something, are worried. Where Gramsci went with it was to ask about the consciousness of the Italian mass of people, the working class. That led him to become a scholar of the Roman Catholic Church. How did that church become so powerful, not just in terms of the cathedrals and the churches and the priests, but in the deep consciousness, in the subconscious almost? He becomes interested in psychology. Try to understand what this churchiness is. What happens to a person who's baptized at birth, who has the sacraments as they go through life, who sits at the end with the dying relative and has the priest go through the procedures that go with all that. So he asked that question. Then he asked the questions about work, the attitude of a worker to doing a good job, this interesting desire to hold on to the sense, I do good work, even knowing that the harder you work at doing good work, the more you're making profit for somebody who's not only other than you, but is going to use that process to screw you 12 different ways, and your family as well. How do you work all that out? So it becomes, and that's why he's so powerful, it becomes the first, I mean, I'm giving him a little bit more than he deserves, but he deserves a lot. One of the early Marxists, Georg Lukács, a Hungarian, was another one, but one of the early ones who really began the interest in Marxists to go beyond economics and politics and look hard and with deep respect at how culture works, how ideology works, how religion works, to understand this. how the capitalists, the employers, who are in fact a small minority of the community, are able to be as powerful, to govern, because they can put together an alliance. They can go find other parts of society and work a deal with them so that this minority, through these connections, can become dominant, or in his language, become hegemonic, be able to control the society as a whole, even though they are a small and in and of themselves vulnerable minority, until they have hooked in, for example, the religious community, perhaps, and the artistic community, and the skilled workers' sense of themselves. And the minute you see what Gramsci's trying to do for Italy, the ability to apply that to the United States today jumps at you.
Right. So, and also I would go so far as into looking at ourselves self-critically, like in terms of how we replicate these things in our own communities and our own activities. And obviously some of it is unavoidable. I'm not especially having grown up without any money, I'm not a hair shirt person. So I'm not talking about, these like, oh, well, you shouldn't make a profit or make a living or any of this sort of thing. We live in the world as it is. But then conversely, when we're constantly, even if we're discoursing a certain politics, but we don't treat each other with compassion or solidarity, or we don't try to at least somewhat model or prototype something different in our own, spaces, we could be replicating that same hegemony.
Well, yeah, I think if Gramsci were here today, I'll pick a provocative example. If Gramsci were here today, he would say something like this to us, say about the last 50 years of the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO is a minority. It's the organized workers, the unionized workers. Back in the 1940s, 50s, they had a third of the private sector workforce in the unions. That's a minority, but a strong one. Mm-hmm. They needed to understand, they didn't, but they needed to understand that like the employers, a smaller minority, they had to build their own, using Gramsci's language now, counter-hegemon. In other words, they had to struggle for hegemony, and to do that, they had to build alliances. Now, coming out of the Great Depression, they already had an alliance. They had an alliance with two socialist parties and a communist party, and they were big in those days. And all of the people who were touched by all of that, which is a lot of people, they either could build on that coalition, which had been very successful in the 1930s, getting us little things, Social Security, unemployment compensation, a minimum wage, and a federal jobs program, which affected, almost every family in the country one way or another.
Right.
So they had proven that they were powerful. They were proven that they could act politically. They had proven that they could become close to hegemonic, since every one of those things I just mentioned was opposed by the business community with fervor all through the 1930s, but they lost. Instead, the anti-communism after the war got to the union leadership, the AFL-CIO, and they broke that coalition. They went down the rabbit hole of anti-communism.
And that was a hegemonic project.
And that
hegemonic strategy.
Yes, it was a hegemonic strategy of the ruling groups in this country, but they got the active cooperation of a trade union leadership that didn't think it needed allies and a coalition. It went on its own, and it's been 70 years of decline that we see as the result. And even with this 70 years of decline, and by decline I mean the number of people in a union goes down virtually every year for the last 70 years, despite those years, they still, to this day, are very anxious about allying with people on the left. You could see it with Bernie. Only a small number of unions went with him the first time,
right.
Maybe a bit more this time. Some of them have learned. But the hesitance is like what you said a moment ago. There's something deep inside. The American people were traumatized by the destruction of the New Deal coalition to the point where getting involved in any collective enterprise with a leftist tinge is scary, is something that, without understanding it, my students who don't know any of this history and certainly didn't live it, they feel anxious in a way they can't pinpoint, even when they're honest enough to admit it. And my argument is that's Gramsci's wisdom. something was done to immobilize the risk of a counter-hegemony to better solidify the hegemony of the employers.
How do we build counter-hegemony?
Well, the first thing is to recognize the problem. It's like with everything else. The first step forward is to recognize that the labor movement, for example, if we were to start there, we don't have to, but if we were, has to have broad social allies. If there's a feminist movement, rush towards it to build an alliance. If there's an anti-racist movement, do it there. If there's a movement for gay liberation, wherever it is.
Did you see some of this in the Chicago teachers strike, which
Yeah.
I just keep emphasizing? I think that was so important. We think of these big things which were huge, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, and Bernie, but in 2013, I think it was, there was the great teachers strike, an uprising against the Rahm Emanuel mayoralty. And there's a lot of reporting about how but it wasn't just a strike. They were helping parents find other places that kids could go. There was so much more happening in terms of a base of the teachers saying, like, not only do we need more, obviously, but we could use what's happening in these schools as a launching point for all of the assaults, gentrification, loss of housing, all of these things. And they really had a sense of that, I think.
I think they do, but
Yeah.
I don't mean to be depressing anyone.
But they need to become
I think
communists, goddammit. I get it. I know.
No.
Core brand proposition.
On the right, I think they're still ahead of it. I think,
Yes.
Mr. Trump is going to be the ally of fundamentalists in the traditional religions. He gets it. He has never shown the slightest respect for any of that. He's never participated. He has made public and private jokes at the expense of those people, as the traditional Republicans always did, the Bushes and all the others. But he is going to go further to solidify them. He has to, in part, living the life he has, with ex-wives and all the rest of it. So he has to, in some sense, go further. But he's eager to do that. He's eager to do it with the military. He's eager to do it with the National Rifle Association. He understands, perhaps better than even the other Republicans, that you have to work hard at these hegemonic alliances. You have to renew them. You have to refresh them. And you have to go however far it takes. The left may be outraged by the latest Trumpism, but those Trumpisms are all of a piece. Whether he understands it or not, who cares?
Right.
He is holding on as best he can to that core of 30 to 40%, whatever it is, that are the people he needs to hold on to, including the threats, which are right up Gramsci's idea. The threat, I don't know if you noticed when Cohen, his former attorney, was finishing his testimony, one of the last things he said was, and if he loses, I'm not sure he's going to leave the job. That's a threat. It's the kind of threat he repeats from time to time. But he wants people to understand that I have enough hegemony, not over a majority, not even close, but I have enough that I can make it impossible for this society to function. Don't push me. He said that to the Republicans during the race, the others that he was running against when he won the nomination, and he's continuing. Remember with Hillary, when he said, she said, you will agree to abide by the results of the election. He waffled.
Yep.
He didn't want to be caught. These are ways of cementing your people together, and something comparable on the other side, I don't see that often. I see much quicker willingness to forgo an alliance, forgo a coalition.
Well, you see, a great example of that, we talk about her a lot, is how they relate to Ilhan Omar, right? I mean, there's a handful of people, I think very clearly in the last cycle of this outrageous incitement against her. Sanders has been clear. Warren's been clear. Tulsi Gabbard put out a good video. But you see, I mean, as an example, Nancy Pelosi, right? She's the leader of the Democrats, for God's sake. And her angle was in this appalling video. And I'm when I call something appalling, I'm good at that because I'm, for better or for worse, my usual default mode with Trump maybe should be more outrage. I still find the guy pretty funny, obscene. I want to defeat him and everything, but I'm not the typical, I can't believe he. First of all, I can. And secondly, sometimes it's pretty funny in a disgusting way. But this one really was a video splicing her footage with celebrations of the September 11th terrorist attacks, disgusting and absolutely incitement, in my opinion. And her angle of, essentially it's really tasteless to use 9/11 footage like that, completely evading the actual reality of what the Republican Party and all of their media apparatus is doing here to someone who's literally facing death threats, is a great example, I think, of what you're talking about. And also the fact that how could that ever even be counter-hegemonic? I mean, I think of the first election that I, could vote in, and it was Kerry and Bush. And that it's interesting because even in that narrow lane, it was, we need to beat terrorism and we want to give you more freedom to own houses. And the answer was, God damn, we got to beat this guy. That was it. He's really bad. And I went to Vietnam.
I must know.
Right.
But to build these hegemonic alliances, I mean, you really have to understand that that's what we need to do. It doesn't mean that you give up your own positions, your own identity, your own particular focus in whatever movement, gets you going and motivates you, excites you. You can stay with your position and you can disagree with others, but you can do that in the context of an alliance. If a fundamentalist Christian who believes that God is running everything can get into political bed with Mr. Trump, who grabs pussy, I mean, for God's sake,
For God's sake, we can be a
you
little
can
bit
see
less-
people who understand,
Right.
even if they don't never read a word of Gramsci, they understand a deal.
Right.
By the way, these deals can unravel. It's just not it's not made in cement. It has to be cultivated, and both sides have to give something, but they're doing it over there in a way that I think the left has to catch up
Be
to.
far more strategic and less dogmatic, too.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, David?
Well, I think like another way to think about hegemony too is like an example is like country music in the United States, right? So think about like the 60s and 70s, like you have the outlaw country music, like Johnny Cash, right?
Right.
Like if you listen to Johnny Cash lyrics, like they're really radical,
We
really
like Johnny
powerful.
Cash. Yeah.
I mean, like Man in Black is an incredible song. He talks about poverty, he talks about, mass incarceration, he talks about ending the war in Vietnam. Imagine something like that going on the country radio today. It wouldn't happen. And what you see in the 90s is you see a consolidation of power of a few small record companies that basically pushed out any kind of more radical left-wing ideas in country music. And now you see country music being more identified as like a right-wing genre of music. Right. And that's how you also create, like now all these people who grow up in the South and that's like their traditional, the music that they listen to or that think is like their cultural music. It comes imbued with all these ideas that are being fed to them, and it's not even an organic thing. And understanding that aspect of politics too, I think is something that we really have to get better on the left, like significantly better, because the right is everywhere.
And think of the irony, the choice of folk music or country music. In the 50s and 60s, at the height of anti-communism, it was the reverse. The country music and the folk music was almost the literature of opposition. The leaders were Pete Seeger, who's a communist, Woody Guthrie.
And like a literal, I just want to underline, a literal communist.
That's right.
Not,
A member
not
of the
social,
party.
Yeah, he was a
Woody
communist,
Guthrie,
right.
another one.
Right.
And the Weavers, another group. They were the dominant things. You went to a folk music concert, 90% of those performers were left, by modern American standards, far left. So the music was going directly up into the left when the popular culture was going through the McCarthy period. So there's an unevenness here, but there's also a lesson that the music that is going in one direction now can go in another one if we are aware. For example, suppose the American left listened to what you just said and took as an important goal the beginning of finding and celebrating and building the audience of those musicians who, and they're there. They're there. We know they're there. We celebrate the few that there are now. What about making it a real project to help them, to bring them to the conferences, to put them on the television shows in order to understand the importance of popular music, which has always been an important place. Gramsci wrote about popular music.
There's a line, I don't remember what book it's from. It might be Born Fee Dead, which is a great book about Jamaica and Jamaican gang politics and really how it was accelerated by Reagan, same dynamics in some ways. But they had a line, they would say, and I'm paraphrasing this, but it was something to the effect of the perception at a certain time, this is probably back in the 70s, that reggae, that country was white people reggae. They perceived it as like, oh no, this is about being poor, it's about struggling. Like, they saw a total kinship in that music. That's like well before the reversal you're talking about. So, I mean, all of these things are very malleable.
And I remember I was living in New Haven, Connecticut at the time and working with the AFL-CIO Central Labor Council. And I remember being taken aback by the number of workers, men and women, who came to the monthly meetings of the council and who loved that song, I forget the artist's name, Take This Job and Shove It. Remember that? Mm-hmm. That was an incredibly exciting, and just the words. Take this job and shove it. I'm not working here anymore. Whatever the lines were, this was exactly what they wanted to hear.
This is better
Johnny
than
Paycheck.
The Johnny Paycheck is better than Darlene Left Me and Let's Bomb Sudan. Yeah.
No, and it's also during that period of time too. Not to derail us on this, but like in the '60s and '70s, this is the American Indian movement was going on,
right?
And these guys, Waylon Jennings, at this period of time was one of the most popular artists in the country. And the American Indian movement, they were literally like fighting the United States like in armed rebellion,
right?
And like those people were supporting them. These were powerful movements.
You had, and I remember, and that great point and counterpoint where Marlon Brando at the Academy Awards that year had someone from AIM, right? And then the counterpoint, though, I have to say, is Clint Eastwood in total. He came up and he said, "I want to honor all of the dead cowboys in our movies," which was both. Yeah. So it's an amazing clip because he's an asshole and totally reactionary, but it's also, though, a precursor to like 1990s Too Cool for Politics, because he isn't doing like, I'm so offended you do that. He's doing like, all right, everybody, let's not be so serious.
Also, I'm compelled.
Which became the kind of irony mode.
Yeah, I'm compelled to add that the early cowboys weren't white guys, typically speaking.
Well, that's very true. But he was literally talking about movie cowboys.
Yeah.
He was just being an asshole. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.